Good evening, everyone. I'll start today with an acknowledgement of country. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we create and share our learning resources. We acknowledge the traditional owners as the original storytellers, teachers and students of the land we call Australia, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. We also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. And today I'm presenting on Wurundjeri country, part of the Kulin Nation. So hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the second of our 4-part webinar series on applying the science of reading in your classroom. My name is Bryn. I'm part of the marketing and events team at Oxford University Press in Melbourne. Today we'll be exploring the topic of reducing student cognitive load to allow for greater focus on new learning, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for this webinar series, Dr. Nathaniel Swain. Nathaniel is a teacher, instructional coach and researcher. With expertise in language, literacy, instructional practices and cognitive science, Dr. Swain is dedicated to empowering teachers to develop life-changing language and literacy skills in every student through effective and engaging teaching. He produces a blog for teachers called Dr. Swain's Cognitorium and is co-host of the Chalk Dust podcast with Rebecca Birch. Working at La Trobe University and the Department of Education in Victoria, Nathaniel has taught a range of learners in schools and tertiary settings. Dr. Swain founded a community of teachers committed to the science of learning, Think Forward Educators, which is now 25,000 members and growing. Dr. Swain is a sought-after speaker on educational circuits and has a best-selling book entitled Harnessing the Science of Learning, Success Stories to Help Kickstart Your School Improvement. Nathaniel has also contributed as a literacy and instructional expert on Oxford's new systematic synthetic phonics program, Essential Letters and Sounds Australia. Welcome, Nathaniel, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Bryn, and thank you everyone at Oxford University Press for hosting these webinars. It's a great way to connect with so many fantastic educators and teachers around the country and internationally. And I'm really excited to delve into this topic with you today on reducing student cognitive load to allow for greater focus on new learning. So cognitive load theory is the flavor of the month. There's lots of big focuses on this. And you might be asking why, or you might have already figured out how this can help your teaching and help the work that you're doing. But let's jump right into that and talk about explicit teaching and I guess where we're headed next, and just how important this might be for your work. So let me just get my things a bit straighter here for myself. And there we go. So we are going to look at this first. So what is explicit teaching? Let's look at that quickly, and then we'll jump back into cognitive load and how it all ties together. Explicit teaching, as we mentioned in the last webinar, is a structured, interactive, high student participation approach that includes the following: activating students' prior knowledge, stating clear learning objectives, making sure that that's really clear what we're trying to achieve with our students, providing explicit explanations of new knowledge in manageable chunks, as well as providing sufficient modeling and scaffolding. So using an approach like I do, we do, you do, for example, where the teacher shows and models what they're asking the students to do, and frequent checks for understanding to inform those responsive teaching decisions that should be happening on a lesson by lesson and or minute by minute basis as students are progressing through the lesson. So explicit teaching is not just one thing. You can see it's quite a number of different approaches that sort of come together in a constellation. And ideally, explicit teaching, when done effectively, is highly adaptive and highly responsive. And it's really important to think about these aspects as helping you to realize your goals of being a responsive and a powerful educator in the classroom. We talked last time in the previous webinar also about opportunities to respond, to show that explicit teaching should be very active. So an opportunity to respond includes any time that you get your students to actively do something. So they might be saying things, finding things, identifying, repeating, gesturing, counting, talking to their partners, answering questions, reading something, ideally sounding something out, spelling something, or explaining something. And it's really important to think, have I got enough opportunities to respond in this explicit teaching part of the lesson, given that this will be what allows your students to fully participate, and also what you can use to get checking for understanding happening. And that brings us to that CFU definition we talked about last time as well. So checking for understanding is the teacher continually verifying that students are learning what is being taught while it's being taught. And this is a really powerful definition because it helps teachers to focus on what's really, really important. So looking at engagement norms and checking for understanding now. So engagement norms are ways in which you can get your students to do those opportunities to respond. So I've got some dog sound effects in the background at the moment. So he's a little bit old and needing a little bit of extra support sometimes. So apologies for that. So real life examples happening here. Essentially, what kinds of checking for understanding procedures might you be using? Things like pair shares, things like mini whiteboards, and seeing those student responses, whether it's this number of sounds or the spelling word, or how to break up the word into sounds, for example. Using track with me or read with me, for example. So hearing the students read along with you. So choral reading, that's the read with me, or track with me is getting students to track along as you're reading or decoding or spelling a word. You can get students to vote. Do you hear the sound or don't you hear the sound, for example? Or do you agree or disagree that this has the p sound in it, for example? As well as these very, sometimes controversial, the idea of picking a student name out of a cup or a cold call, but really something that shouldn't be really cold, that actually you warm students up to and that you help them feel successful in. So that's explicit teaching. What's that got to do with cognitive load theory? I want to introduce you right into it and to give you some examples that you can hopefully connect with and that may connect with what you've looked at before. And then we're going to circle back about how the two ideas, so explicit teaching and cognitive load theory, comes together to basically help you improve your teaching of reading and spelling, but any subject really. So maths, history, geography, science, you name it. But particularly reading and spelling we're going to look at because it is just so powerful. So the simple model of memory, just a quick show of reactions. People who've heard of this before. So you can give one of the positive reactions there to tell me that you've heard of the simple model of memory, or what's sometimes called the information processing model. Just a quick sort of reaction there if you can. Not many reactions. That's interesting. So the information processing model or the simple model of memory, both are the same thing. Okay, some reactions now. They're essentially the same thing. I'm going to run through it in just a moment, but they tell us about the problem of the working memory bottleneck. So that is the fact that there's an aspect of our learning system that is rather limited and that has a constraint on it. And then this dovetails beautifully into, so Alexa's having a little conniption in the background. This dovetails beautifully into this idea of cognitive load theory. So let me take you through the simple model of memory now. Thank you for being patient. So the simple model of memory is a way of thinking about information processing and what new learners are required to do in order to make it work. Okay. So the environment we can learn from, the world around us, the books that we read, what our teachers tell us, is infinite. Interestingly, long-term memory, where all this learning around us can be stored, is also practically limitless. There's no reason to ever stop learning, and there's no storage capacity limits that scientists know of at this stage. In order to get that learning in there, we need to have our students' attention, though. If they're not paying attention, nothing from the environment, things that they read or hear or see, can actually get into that long-term memory. Ideally, if the system was working well, you would have their attention and then they would just learn stuff. Unfortunately, there's one more part of this system which is really important to know, and that is working memory. And working memory is not like long-term memory at all. It is incredibly limited. It is constrained and only has a few items of space in it at one time and can only be held in working memory for a short amount of time before it's then refreshed. So it's important to think of your job when you're teaching is to manage the amount of things that you're putting in students' working memory at once. How many things are they having to hold? And therefore, have I accidentally overloaded their working memory? And this is where the idea of cognitive overload comes in. That's not the end of the model, though. There's also forgetting. So forgetting is part of this model. Essentially, students may forget things that just enter their working memory, but they might also forget things that are from their long-term memory as well. So actually having an opportunity to do retrieval practice and review, which we'll look at in later sessions, is incredibly important to allow students to consolidate their learning and to see if they can retain all of that in long-term memory rather than just letting it be forgotten. Ideally, all that great stuff that we teach as teachers gets remembered. And then we do our job well, rather than teaching it one day and then not coming back to it until that's well and truly forgotten. When this model's working well, students can remember things, and that enables them to handle more in their working memory because what they're drawing down on is familiar and is from their long-term memory. So I'll explain this a little bit further, but essentially we can help students to manage more and more complexity by essentially allowing them to go from what might appear to be meaningless, so little squiggles on the page that may make a sound, may not make a sound, to eventually something that's meaningful, where they see whole words that they recognize, or orthographically mapped words like we talked about in the previous webinar, where they actually can recognize that word as one unit rather than a series of squiggles that make some sounds and then have to be blended together. And that is the really cool thing about cognitive load theory. So interestingly, John Sweller, who came up with cognitive load theory, does regret calling it that now. So he regrets putting that emphasis on the load or the working memory limitation. When actually the cool thing about this model is that when we have things in our long-term memory, we can pull them down, we can remember them, and there's no storage constraints here. So you can put as much in your long-term memory as you want, and there's also no storage sort of constraints in terms of how easy it is to retrieve. You can pull down all kinds of things from long-term memory, and that's just instantly pops into your students' heads. So the whole idea is to pass through that initial annoying stage where learning might be quite slow, laborious, and might need to be stepped out quite carefully, into students being able to master and consolidate all of that knowledge so that they don't actually feel like novices anymore, and they can start doing more and more interesting things, say with their reading or their writing or any subject. So what is cognitive load theory? This definition from Ollie Lovell is quite good. It's a series of instructional recommendations that's built upon the knowledge of how humans learn. And there's two kinds of load that I want you to think about that you can think about manipulating in different ways to improve your instruction. The first kind of load that I want to look at is extraneous load, which is stuff that's additional to the learning intention. So stuff that you don't really need the students to be focusing on to master the learning itself. And then the opposite for the intrinsic load, the learning that we want students to have. So what do you want them to be able to do, and how difficult is the task? Is it just right, or is it too hard, or is it too easy? So if you remember nothing else about cognitive load theory, it's this recommendation that's coming. And that is, I'll just jump ahead, that is that we want to try and optimize the intrinsic load. So get it just right, not too hard, not too easy, and to minimize, the extraneous load. So make sure that there's as few distractions as possible so that it maximizes the chances of students being able to remember all the great things that they learned about, which is the intrinsic load. Just a little bit more about categorizing that load. So extraneous cognitive load comes from the manner and structure of instruction. Sometimes it's the environment, sometimes it's the background noise, but sometimes it's the way that we're explaining things. Have we dressed it up in a story and made it quite convoluted? Or have we delivered the information clearly and effectively? And that way reduce the amount of noise in what we're talking about, the explanations. Ideally, we're giving clear and specific and succinct guidance, as well as clear bulletproof definitions of new concepts or new ideas, rather than long sort of laborious explanations that go on and on and on. The other way to manage extraneous load is to make sure that you're not choosing the wrong time for that great anecdote or that great story that you might want to tell your students. Sometimes we might take away from the students' attention and have them focusing on something irrelevant because it seemed like a good idea at the time to tell that particular cat or dog story. So it's not just the environment, although that's part of the extraneous load. We also need to think about being more efficient and more effective in the way that we're providing information to students. Intrinsic load, on the other hand, is the load associated with the core learning taking place. And it's the load that we want students' working memory to be associated with and occupied with. Just a little bit of extraneous load happening just there as my slides are clicking around a little bit. So ideally, there's no extraneous load. Intrinsic load is how hard the task is. How much information have you provided? Is it the right amount, or is it too much or too little? You can get it wrong in both directions and have it so that it's too easy, where the students find it boring and not hard enough, or too hard and too many steps or too many bits and pieces all presented at once. So this is the game that we have to play. So we said before, the fundamental recommendation is to optimize the intrinsic load, just get that just right. So it's not too hard, not too easy, and to minimize the extraneous load. So this is avoid all those distractions where possible. Let's talk about the red first, the minimizing extraneous load. So how can you reduce it? There's a few different ways. You can reduce distractions of all kinds or any kind. You can avoid novelty. without good reason. So just mixing it up, we're just going to do this activity or this routine differently today just for fun. You might actually be creating more extraneous load. Routines can be really powerful. Predictable lesson structures can be really powerful. Having a sequence of lessons that you have that makes it easy for your students to learn those reading and writing skills might be really powerful in the end. What I said earlier, bulletproof definitions, clear explanations, not long-winded, not sort of roundabout, not indirect, clear, succinct, very to the point can be really powerful to reduce that extraneousness. Eliminate redundancy. This is a tricky one because sometimes we're told that more is more. So show it visually, show it verbally, show it in written form, get them to draw it in the air, etc., etc. And sometimes we're asking students to look at more than one thing at once. But that redundancy potentially can have a problematic effect on the amount of load that the students are managing. So sometimes minimalism and less could be more in terms of focusing students' attention on what's really important. Yes, we can have multiple ways to look at material, but maybe don't ask them to look at everything at once. And if one logical way serves the same purpose, maybe we can reduce it to one if that's what allows students to experience that success in the short time. My only other point here is worked examples can be really powerful. This is where if you're teaching blending and segmenting, giving lots of models, lots of opportunities where students can see you blending and segmenting words for reading and for spelling so that they can then master that skill can be very, very powerful. Doing that with letters and with visuals that go along with the verbal that you're doing can be really helpful because then you're connecting what they're hearing and what they're seeing together and allowing a strong anchor point. I'm going to delve into something now which is somewhat controversial depending on the topic or depending on the audience, and that's about extraneous load and classroom arrangement. So this is a typical primary classroom where a lot of primary classrooms are organized into these clusters, and I do worry, given the extraneous load for these particular students here that are facing almost directly away from the learning and having to turn their bodies or turn their necks or find it a lot easier to just talk to the person next to them rather than to face the front and to hear the modeling and the ideas at the front of the room. So I've got in the next series of slides an opportunity for you to think about other ways that you could organize your room. If you look at this way, for example, this might seem really old school and really sort of nasty, and you might think, oh, this is not for me. And that is sometimes a legitimate feeling that you might have about this looking too old school. The other problem with this arrangement is that there's no way to get to these students in the middle, which you really want to be able to reach them and to give them feedback. So ideally, if nothing else, you would put in a channel that allows you to move around more easily. So that can be a way of reducing extraneous load, making it easy for the students to hear and see the teacher. If that doesn't float your boat, you may want to consider something like this, a combined U-shape. U-shapes have also got a lot of good evidence behind them. And I would encourage you to look at some of my blog posts about this topic if you want to delve deeper into what these look like. But this is a nice combination, as is this one. People kind of love this one. This is the triple chevron. This is like clusters, like rows, but I guess not as nasty, sort of, and it does give you some floor space if you want to use this well. Some people are putting a love heart emoji for that one. This is kind of cool, right? It really does depend, though, what your room is like, what your dimensions are, what your space limitations are, and how you want to use your space. There are options available to you. This one I kind of love as well. So this is called a pair square model. The reason it's called pair squares is because you've got lots of pair shares or turn and talks happening with each of these partners, but these are also clustered into groups, which when you give the direction, the front two tables can turn around, and then you can have collaborative groups back again, and you can get them back quite quickly there, which is not too tricky to do. This is a nice flexible one that allows you to do cool things. If you know that you've got multiple uses for multiple arrangements, you may want to consider putting sit spots underneath the table legs of each of these tables, and have one arrangement is one color of sit spots, you know, those Velcro dots you can put on the carpet, and maybe another arrangement would be another set of colors. And this is a really powerful thing to enable you to make decisions about how you can flexibly use the space. I have got a question from Daniel C, which I'll just do a little answer for, if that's okay. So what's your view or evidence on students sitting at desks for, say, 30 minutes learning and writing on mini whiteboards versus sitting, I'm guessing, on the floor as the contrast there, say children in lower years, foundation to year 2? So the evidence is not so strong on whether to use the desks or the tables, I have to say. There's more about classroom arrangements and table arrangements, which says that whatever the learning intention is, make the arrangement suit that. So if it's collaborative problem solving is what you're looking to do, obviously have them in groups where they can work closely with a partner or work with a group of 4, like the first arrangement I showed you. But if you're asking them to do explicit guidance and get lots of feedback on mini whiteboards and things at the front of the room, you might want to consider one of these other arrangements. However, the use of the floor space could be a really strategic one in the early years. And I quite like using the floor space in foundation and year 1. So that's prep in year 1, for example, so that you can actually get the group closer and get more sort of out of that group and sort of see what they're doing in a closer vicinity. So I would say that depending on your space, you want to potentially have both, where you have a floor space and some desk space, and have that option to go back to your tables for some of the time or back to the floor as a nice transitional movement break between either one. So if you had this arrangement, for example, which I used to have in my own classroom, this particular arrangement, I had some more space here in front before the screen was there. And then when it was time to go back to tables, I used to bring the screen forward. It was on wheels, luckily, so I could do that. Otherwise, you might want to do an arrangement that gets the best of both worlds, with some space on the floor, but then enough, not too far back so people at the back of the room can still see the screen carefully. This is all interesting things that you can play around with. So hopefully that is helpful. And no worries, Daniel, on getting the name wrong. That's not a problem. One more from Joanne. With the table arrangements, would you have one path during the middle and just have tables divided to the left and right hand side instead of grouping tables in lots of 2s? You could have them as separate tables, but I love the groups of 2s or groups of 4s because it allows you to get to more of your students, and also allows students to work with a partner throughout the session rather than working just by themselves. So the pair share work that you can do with groups of 2s in whichever arrangement, I think I've got them in 2s for all of them. The possibilities are quite helpful. So ideally, though, if you don't have a lot of space, you could, for example, have some of these up against the wall if you just couldn't get around them, and use this center channel, as long as there is enough room between here to be able to get to these students on the end. These are all little things to consider. So thank you very much for your questions so far. We'll come back to them. Let's keep going. Some people are doing a party emoji, like, yeah, keep the party going. Let's do it. So that's one way you can manage extraneous load, as well as reducing distractions and background noise, and other sorts of ones that we've talked about. Let's talk about intrinsic load for the moment. Just a little quote here from Lovell, who is an Ollie. I'm not an Ollie, but he is. New information occupies more working memory capacity than familiar information. So this one's a big one. Essentially, when you're teaching something new, you need to make space for it, because new stuff will overwhelm students' working memory more so than information that they've seen before. So one of the ways you can do that is by managing or optimizing the intrinsic load of the task. Obviously, reduce the extraneous load. Try and make that as easy as possible for students to focus without all those distractions. But you can also do things to manage or optimize the intrinsic load. So how can you do that? There's 2 options. You can chunk, or you can automate. Chunking is combining smaller elements which you've broken down back together into larger ones within long-term memory. So essentially saying, I want you to be able to do this. So read multisyllabic words. How can I get you to there? I'm going to go backwards from multisyllabic to two-syllable words, to one-syllable words, to words with a particular set of graphemes. And I'll start with that chunk and get you really good at reading and spelling words with the small number of graphemes, and master that for spelling and for reading, and build up from there. Eventually, students chunk all that knowledge together, and they can recognize whole syllables and whole words because of all of that orthographic mapping that you've hopefully done. So ideally, it pulls together and you're able to get reading fluency out of that. It's a long process for some students, but that's essentially what we're adding up to. It's why we do synthetic phonics, because it allows us to go back and really explain those pieces and how they all add up together. Chunking, therefore, reduces the cognitive load of tasks. So this is being able to do the good work of great teaching, is by appropriately breaking down the learning into manageable chunks. And therefore, chunking enables us to handle increasingly complex thoughts. And this is the really cool thing, that as you get students used to those chunks and build them up into long-term memory, they can then do more interesting, complicated things. They could write their own stories. They can read their own full stories in text, when before they might have only read single words or decodable text of a limited sort of focus. Let's talk about automating, though, because this is equally as important. Automating is allowing students to be free from thinking about routine or familiar concepts, procedures, or strategies. This is really, really key. And if the dog keeps barking, I'll just put him outside so he can have a little breather for just a second. He might be doing that. So in the chat, could you provide a little response to this idea? What are some of the things you're looking to automate in the next part of your teaching, whether it's around reading and spelling preferably, but other aspects of the curriculum as well, if you're interested? What are you trying to make students be able to do that they don't have to think about anymore? They just do automatically. And then I'll just put the dog in the next room. One moment. Okay, thank you for your participation in some of those. Some people are saying morphology, being able to incorporate more understanding through problem solving and eliminate memorizing. Interesting. So I'm interested in that, Joanne, and I guess what the focus has been and how you've gotten there. Thank you for the people who've put that in. Number bonds to 10, number facts. Yes, great. So allowing them to have that automatically retrieved rather than having to think it through or problem solve it every time, so they can focus on what the actual task is, which is excellent. All right, so automating essentially is freeing up cognitive load for new learning. So whether it's something around a routine for learning, or whether it's being able to automatically retrieve the sounds that a grapheme makes, or the choices that you might have, the tricky words that you're trying to get them to spell, hard to read and spell words, for example. Automating essentially means that they don't have to use all their cognitive load on trying to figure that one thing out, and instead have that as a given that just is easy to think about, and allowing them to focus on what's the new part, which is really, really quite clever. So is this how we learn all the time? This is something really important to think about. Most of what we've talked about is when we're talking about new learning. The word novice essentially comes from the Latin root, which means new. So a novice is defined by someone who is new to learning or new to that knowledge. And they actually learn quite differently to how experts might learn or continue to push the boundaries. So let's talk about novices versus experts, and then we'll have a nice little discussion about inquiry and where this fits in to all of this explicit teaching that we've talked about so far. So novices in a particular domain will benefit from clear explanations, step-by-step instructions, and worked examples. They might struggle with problem solving in this domain initially because they just don't have enough knowledge. They might not be able to reason their way through reading a whole story by themselves or answering complex questions because they're still trying to decode or they're still trying to figure out what the words mean. Therefore, novices benefit from guided approaches that are fully guided. So not just, a little bit of problem solving and thrown in the deep end, actually being taken through step by step how to do something and therefore get better at it. Experts, on the other hand, can work without explicit guidance because they have stored knowledge already in their long-term memory, which allows them to be really good at problem solving. So it's the knowledge of the domain which actually sets novices and experts apart. So experts are experts by virtue of the knowledge that they have. And that could be declarative knowledge, like I know that this sound, it can be spelt in 5 different ways and I can list them for you, or I know what that word is and what that word means, or I know how to spell that word because I've practiced it before. Or it could be knowledge on procedures, so how to go about writing a sentence or how to go about approaching a comprehension question, for example. And experts in general have more knowledge than novices and will learn in different ways. In fact, they learn through, when you're a real expert, you can learn through actual experimentation. So minimally guided approaches that don't require as much attention or as much explicit modeling and guidance compared to how novices might benefit from that clear approach. So this is a nice distinction to make in our heads, mainly because it it enables us to make different decisions about how we're treating our students across the curriculum and across different areas that they're learning, and essentially when is the right time to pull back on our instruction, allow the students to take the reins and apply. In the early years, there's going to be more guidance and more focus on mastering these aspects through more explicit, fully guided approaches. But as years go on and as students progress into different parts of the curriculum, depending on what we're teaching, we may be able to give students more of that control, which I think is really important. So where's inquiry learning in all of this? I think it's important just to sort of frame that out. Essentially, my colleague Shane Pearson and I take the position that students should inquire from a place of knowledge. So ideally, if they're going to inquire, they're going to do it with a lot of knowledge as a background. So some people might have looked at morphology, for example, and something called structured word inquiry, which in the way that it's framed up might involve a lot of independent searching for different words and the roots and prefixes and suffixes that make them up. My problem with structured word inquiry is that it probably gets novices inquiring from a place of relative ignorance rather than a place of knowledge. So I would only get students to go off and research morphology or different parts once I know that they've got a really strong background and that I've given them lots of practice of how to read, spell, and understand all of those word parts and how they come together. A great question from Joanne. I'll just handle it quickly. Would you incorporate more verbal learning through sounds and definitions as opposed to students copying words and definitions down and combining both learning methods? So I would say that in classrooms that are doing this kind of work really well, there's a lot of verbal engagement of students rather than them just sitting and listening. All those engagement norms and opportunities to respond are incredibly important. So lots of opportunities to say the words, pronounce the words, gesture for the meaning of the words, provide the definition to their partners, being able to write and try and sound out and spell the words for themselves rather than just copying down. When you're getting them to just copy things down, there isn't as much active retrieval going on. So it's important that you actually give students a lot of opportunity to do the full process after they've seen lots of modeling from the teacher. So that's a really important point. Essentially, with inquiry learning, when you teach more responsibly and explicitly in the first few stages, then you can level the playing field. So it gives novice learners a chance, and not chance to build up knowledge and mental models for later generative, creative, and critical use. So the whole point of doing explicit responsive practice is so that you can get students to do all kinds of cool things and go off and explore things beyond the realms of what the teacher has laid out. In this way, I would make the firm argument that explicit teaching isn't a pendulum from inquiry back again. It's actually paving the way for independent application and inquiry. And in that way, it can be seen as the best of both worlds when you have explicit teaching that then leads to independent application and exploration. That's my little pitch to you. I want to tell you a little bit more about, I guess, how this learning process model works in terms of where the role of explicit teaching can help students to master more complex tasks. So let me just do that with this little demonstration. So why should we teach explicitly to manage cognitive load? Essentially, because when students first encounter new learning, they're going to feel potentially overwhelmed by the complexity of all the things that are happening. So they might try and hold all that complexity in their heads, but as they bring it into their working memory, it gets overloaded and ultimately gets forgotten. When they come to that task after some instruction, though, so a teacher comes along and teaches them something that might be helpful, a grapheme, phoneme correspondence, a maths fact, a process to follow, then students can manageably hold that in their working memory and then encode that and put it into long term when they can use it later. When they come to the same task that they did before, they then are able to draw upon their long-term memory and use that heuristic, that knowledge, that skill, and essentially see things that they couldn't see before in the messiness of the task as it had previously existed. Now that they've got more knowledge, they don't feel as overwhelmed by the task at hand, which is essentially why we should try and teach explicitly in the first instance when we're working with novice learners and when we're trying to get them to learn new things, because new learning always occupies more working memory capacity than something that's familiar. So in case I still haven't convinced you, where is the line between explicit and more guided, more exploratory or inquiry sort of based approaches? I really like Tom Sherrington's distinction here between mode A versus mode B teaching. I think this helps explain the whole role of the teacher in what we can think about in terms of our work. For me, it's not either or in terms of inquiry versus explicit. It's really important that we see both as supportive of each other. So Joanne's got a question about how would we further engage the students who aren't taking knowledge in. my first question would be, why aren't they taking knowledge in, and what is stopping that from happening? Does the teacher have adequate opportunities for students to respond and adequate checking for understanding procedures so that throughout the lesson, students are able to not just sit there and listen, but to use the knowledge and use the ideas that the teacher is sharing in order to answer increasingly complex sort of questions or tasks throughout the lesson, not waiting till the end of the lesson to show that they're understanding, but actually doing it as a course throughout the lesson as it's proceeding, so the teacher can get good information back as well as getting good participation happening. So I'm happy to answer that further again if there's a follow-up, but essentially, if the students aren't taking things in and the CFU questions, the checking for understanding questions the teacher's doing are telling the teacher that the students aren't paying attention or aren't learning, the teacher needs to stop proceeding through the lesson and go back and reteach. And that's where the responsiveness and the adaptability sort of comes in. It's really important that the teacher uses those CFUs, those checking for understanding opportunities, to ensure that they've got things right. So have I got the intrinsic load right? I'm using my CFUs to tell, do the kids have it or don't they have it? Am I getting at least 80% proficiency, or do I need to go back and re-explain because I've got less than 80%? The remaining 20%, in case you're wondering, you can always get through that that independent learning time, or that the I do part where the students are off doing it by themselves. You can work with a small group and to catch up those students. So let's talk about mode A and mode B just briefly. Mode A versus mode B. Mode A is the kind of explicit and responsive practices that we've just been talking about. So mode A, you explain things, the teacher, you model things, the students practice, you check and give them feedback, you test them, and then you test them again a bit later to see if they've retained it. The explicit sort of fully guided approaches is what we're talking there. Mode B, on the other hand, is the students are just exploring, they're discovering. They're having hands-on experiences. You might inspire some awe, so they get really, caught up in the wonder of all the great ideas and stories and content you're sharing. You might go off trail in your discussions, and you might get students to make things or to do projects. And interestingly, different schools or different subjects or year levels may differ in how much they do of mode A versus mode B. But for me, I see these as mutually beneficial. And as long as you get your proportions and your order right, everyone wins. So essentially, novice learners benefit from mode A primarily as they're first getting used to some new content and new skills. And mode B makes sense when students have a background of skills and knowledge that are going to help them do it. So in the question box, if you don't mind, see if you could put down what proportion do you think teachers should be using of mode A versus mode B? Is it 100-0? Is it 50-50? Is it 70-30? For example, just out of interest, I'd love to see what your thoughts are. Okay, so some people are putting 30-70. I'm guessing that's 30 mode A, 70 mode B. Interesting. Daniel C is doing 80-20. Janelle's doing 80-20. Phyllis is doing 80-20. 70-30, 60-40, 70-30. And yes, this recording will be available on the Oxford website and YouTube channel after this. So hopefully it is helpful for you and your staff. All right, so I'll give you an approximate one. Tom Sherrington says approximately 80%. Mode A and approximately 20%. But like I said, this may depend on the subject. Maybe in more kinesthetic or applied subjects like media and visual arts and dance and PE, for example, it might be swung a little bit more towards mode B than this. But when you're teaching something new, you probably want to get the proportions right so that there's less application and discovery to begin with, and more explicit modeling, guidance, and feedback. Not to say that's going to be a teacher lecturing, because it should be responsive and adaptive, but it is heavily supported, so a fully guided approach in the initial stages. But I found that many teachers get their questions answered when we talk about this paradigm and help them feel better about the fact that explicit teaching is an important part, but it's not the only part of getting learning happening, and that breaking free of those explicit models and introductions is actually a really important part of the process as well. So this is an example of a work sample from a knowledge-rich unit where we've developed knowledge in my previous school. A colleague of mine, Georgia Paddy, she's gotten their students to learn a whole lot of interesting, fantastic content, reading stories and information reports about rivers over a long period of time. And their Mode B project, their open-ended task and inquiry project, was to create their own river system. which is really cool. So they designed their own river system using natural materials. They took a picture of it and then they annotated it and put in digital sort of additions and pictures like you can see here. But if you look at the detail of this, there's quite a lot of cool stuff. So they've got a boat represented here. They've got a river. They've got a tributary, which they then talk about here. There is a tributary going into the river using language from the unit. This is the mountain. The source of the river is the base of the mountain. You've also got a boat. There's a bridge. People here somewhere. And then the follow-up question the teacher has is, why do people settle close to rivers? And look, there's fish in the ocean, etc. The river is going out into the ocean. The mouth of the river is where the river goes to, I'm not sure what the end of that is. It's sort of cut off a little bit. But this is really cool, right? So this is a project that you could have done as an initial exploration, but which students have come to with a lot more knowledge and a lot more understanding when they've had this opportunity to go after some initial explicit teaching. Okay, so let me just work through for the rest of the session. I've got a little tickle in my throat. Apologies for that. The rest of the session, I've got 3 cognitive load theory of effects that I want to share with you that allow you to get, I guess, the best information possible to make good decisions about your classroom around your classrooms if you're a leader, and how we can get that to work. The first cognitive load theory effect I want to look at is worked examples. Excellent connections there. Okay, so worked examples. Here we go. Worked examples are essentially explained by the worked example effect, which says that novice learners really benefit from worked examples, as we've talked about, and that step-by-step problems solved for students are inherently beneficial. When students have an opportunity to see a problem solved for them, the teacher model, and then are able to solve a matching problem or finish a matching word or a matching spelling pattern, then they're able to definitely make connections between what they're seeing and hearing and understanding, and then what they can show they're learning of. Ideally, we don't do initial problem solving and throwing students in the deep end because this doesn't pay attention to the worked example effect. This effect has been tested by testing that exact thing. So some students given independent problem solving on new learning that they haven't seen before and seeing if struggling through it can make a difference, versus those who've been given the same problem with worked examples explaining how to solve them, and then being able to use that problem to solve a matching problem. Essentially, there's no real benefit for being thrown into the deep end with this kind of new learning, and that novice learners really benefit from someone showing them a reliable methodology. Maybe not the only way to solve the problem, but a one way in which they can do a task or to do that same learning intention step by step, rather than saying, see if you can hold these all together. So the rule of 2 is an interesting one. This is from Hollingsworth and Ybarra. It's one way that you can provide worked examples. So students are guided to solve a matching problem to one that was just modeled. And teachers will check students' progress across each step using mini whiteboards, for example, and reteach if the students are not getting 80% there. So 80% is the go-to figure. You don't always want to wait for 100% of your students to get the answer right, because then the lesson sort of grinds to a halt. You can always get that remaining 20% a little bit later. So worked examples are really powerful. They're an opportunity to essentially model for the students the kinds of things you want them to learn. And as I said before, it's a really great way to break the learning down into manageable chunks and allow students to get that mastery. All right, number 2. This should say number 2 rather than number 1 there. The redundancy effect is the second one I want to talk to you about. And this links to that idea of sometimes too much is possible to show or to give exposure to our students. One of the quotes that I have in my book in chapter with Dr. Zach Groeschel, who's a researcher in the US, is that the teacher's role is to control the flow of information from teacher to student. So if too much information has been provided at once or too many different options, sometimes this can overload working memories. Even if our best intentions are there, we're trying to give them lots of exposures, lots of opportunities to learn. Sometimes less is more. Okay, so the redundancy effect goes like this. It's essentially try and reduce unnecessary information, visual, verbal, written, or otherwise. So try and make sure that it's only the real clear stuff that students need to see that is focused on. If it's not crucial, you can cut it, essentially. If it doesn't actually help and it's just decorative, you might want to consider stripping it back. And less is much, much more initially. You might want to rethink some of your it's what might be a little bit harsh, but unnecessary display. So things that are on display that may not be relevant for that topic or that subject, or maybe just adding to the visual noise or clutter in front of your classroom. And I'm going to show you a visual in just a moment. I've just Googled elementary classroom to try and capture some examples of practice around the world. And I want you to highlight to yourself, just think through what are all the things that are going on and are they all necessary? Because some classrooms don't look very minimalist and very clean and neat. Sometimes they end up looking a bit like this. And this is lovely and it's exciting and it's colorful, but sometimes there's just a little bit too much going on. And this redundancy, this too much information or too much of different things, could be contributing to students' extraneous load. And this is where the redundancy effect plays out. So you can take all that in. You might want to think how you might rethink your own classrooms if you have a classroom like this. I'm not saying here, and I've said in previous blog posts, if you want to check out my website, I'm not saying to have bare walls or to have no color and no life in your classroom. Definitely not. But you may want to think intentionally about what is on display at what times. Do you rotate through your displays? Do you bring them out at certain subjects or certain parts of the day? And are there things that just should be on display at all times? So thinking that through and being really intentional can make sure that you can have the best of both worlds in that sense. The other thing to think about is your learning materials. So this is a lovely passage, and I've put in lots of lovely images here to read this passage on animals, but there's just a lot going on in this slide. So it's probably more interesting to look at this cute, amazing little koala Joey here sitting on top of this koala's head, as well as who doesn't love a cute little lamb wearing a collar, and all of these different kinds of animals, and large and small and big and fat and so on. So lots going on. There's probably a bit too much going on that doesn't necessarily help with learning, because the learning is here in the text that we're going to unpack. And these images are decorative and lovely, but maybe detracting in the initial stages. So I might rethink it and put something like this, which is a bit more minimalist. Just the key information, and break that down and read it with students and ensure that they understand the vocabulary before we then put more context. So providing information in a more stepped out way that allows students not to be overwhelmed by all that information, and then having the CFU question pop up at the right time. Notice it's still on the slide because of an effect that I'm going to talk about in just a moment called the transiency effect. But essentially giving students less being more in the initial stages before you add more complexity. Here's the sentence frame that you might use with your students. And then next slide, you can show some example responses after you hear some of the responses from your students. But this is really critical, that less can be more, and more intentional can be a lot better for your students, because we don't just want to pummel them with information and stimulus thinking that more is more. So redundancy effect continued. We're essentially talking about this. If you go off script, that's okay. Sometimes you do need to explain something that's not on the slide. You don't want to be dictated to by the materials if sometimes you've figured out something else that needs to be said. Don't be a slave to the slides is one of my favorite things to say at the moment to many schools who are using lots of materials and may feel like it's somewhat restrictive. But if you do go off script, just turn off the display. There's a little button down here. If you can see this, I'm not sure. You can just turn the screen off for a moment. And then you're on some clickers as well. So some PowerPoint clickers, there's a little button called B that you can press that will just black the screen out. I don't know if it's going to work here. Yeah. So if I press B on my keyboard, the screen just goes black and it makes it disappear. That's PowerPoint. I'm not sure if it does it on Google Slides, but another reason to download the presentation, open in PowerPoint, because you have a few more options. That's a really cool hack. So if you go off script, that's okay. Turn off the display, explain something on the mini whiteboard or the big whiteboard, and then come back once you're ready. And that's just a way of ensuring that students aren't overwhelmed by all the things coming at them. Also, make sure your students aren't trying to read something while you're saying something else. If you notice them reading new content that's on the screen and you're not ready for them to do that, and you're trying to get them to listen to your instruction, again, just turn this display off. Just make it easy for them to focus and to concentrate. If you have new content that you're trying to get them to look at, ideally, so let's go back for a second. Ideally, you actually break down that content step by step with them before they have to introduce it or read it for themselves. I wouldn't have all of this text on display and be talking about it before students have had a chance to unpack it. Really important that we don't try and create a rod for our back by putting enticing, interesting things up, but expecting students not to read it or engage with it until the right time. So I would read it all together using those engagement norms and track with me and etc., so that students can ensure that when they're looking at things, it's the right time to be breaking it down. So that's that second rule of thumb there, is to ensure students aren't trying to read while you're saying something else. Okay, so one more effect. Great questions from Joanne today. One more question from Joanne was, how much of students' work would you put on display? Essentially, I would put lots of great student work on display. I just wouldn't put it necessarily right at the front of the room. Maybe the sides of the room strategically, probably more to the back of the sides of the room, but definitely right at the back of the room or at the entrance of your classroom as well. Definitely have a place where you can celebrate and showcase that amazing student work. But ideally, it's not hanging from the ceiling and right in front and center as students are trying to focus on that new learning. I like to have a few centers in my classroom. So the front of the room, maybe the mat space, and where the whiteboard and the display is right at the front. And then at the back of the room, another spot where I can obviously have a nice little comfy chair. I can get students to huddle around and to look at all their great work, as well as do some well-being, read some stories, maybe student presentations, just a different mode of instruction, if you like. So some people have a well-being corner or a well-being garden at the back or the corner of their classroom. And that's when they have more of the ethos building, motivation building quotes and lovely things, birthdays. They also might have student work displayed there as well. Be strategic, make your classroom work well for you, but don't think that you have to have everything front and center, because you can't focus on more than one thing at once. All you can do, there's no multitasking, that's a myth. All you can do is shift your attention from one thing to another. And if you've got an amazing display of beautiful work, sometimes that's going to be more interesting than the phonics lesson that you're doing. So you need to make it easy for yourself. Okay, so let's just do the last effect now before we open up for a few questions for the end. And apologies for the numbering being wrong. This is the effect number 3, the transiency effect. So the transiency effect is an interesting one, and sometimes it can rub up against the redundancy effect that we just went on, but this is really important as well. Essentially, if the information is crucial to solve the problem, or in order to practice the spelling words, or say it might be the new grapheme of the day, ideally you keep it. So if it's crucial and they don't already have it in their long-term memory, ideally you have it up so they don't have to use their working memory in order to try and remember what that thing was, because having it transient can create an additional cognitive load that we don't want. Include the key steps during practice. So if you've got 3 steps that you're wanting to do, say you're wanting them to say the word, to sound it out, and then to write the letters for each sound and then check it. Ideally, those steps are very simply put in the corner of your materials, or you've got a poster that says, how do we spell words? How do we read words? And using that process again and again and again will mean that it becomes automated. But initially, you might need to have those steps on display so they can refer back to it. Ideally, you've got important keywords or images as well that you can want to record. So something, if people have been using mini whiteboards a lot, you might want to take a few photos of mini whiteboards in the middle of your lesson or before they rub off their whiteboards to get some of those spelling or writing samples. You can also be intentional about how you use exercise books or worksheets, for example, so you get some permanent records, so that not everything that students practice in the phonics lesson or in other lessons is transient, so that it could be nailed down as well. Really, really important. And be wary, this is an interesting one because pre-teaching is always seen as a positive thing. Beware of only pre-teaching without follow-up support. I'm going to just show you an example of that with vocabulary just now, if that's okay. I think I've got time for it. So this is an example of vocabulary teaching with just pre-teaching, no follow-up support. So here I'm going to teach you 3 new words. Here we go. Pretend you're my year 3 class and we're doing this lesson about Viking raiders. Okay. So first word is cargo. Say cargo. The cargo means goods transported by a ship, plane, or truck. Try and remember cargo. Okay, next one. Goblet. Say goblet. A goblet is a noun. It's a large container used for drinking. Looks like a bit of a chalice or something fancy, like a fancy sort of cup, sometimes made of metal or wood or other materials. Okay, a goblet. Say goblet. Try and remember goblet. And ransom. Ransom is money paid to release someone being held captive. Try and remember ransom. It's important for what we're about to do. And then here's my vocabulary, my passage, and those words are just in there. So you can read this to yourself just for a moment, see if you can find those words, see if you can try and remember what those words mean. Remember, this is sort of my non-example. There's a big red cross on this is what I probably wouldn't do. So there's all kinds of new words in there. There's berserkers and captives and all kinds of other words in there that might be new for our students as well. But hopefully you've remembered those 3 words. Not ideal. I'm going to show you now the opposite of having the same approach, but having the reference available, so that if your students need to check what those words were, say you've still done the pre-teaching, because that can be really great, but actually having the reference available, so that word in a glossary in the corner of their materials on their page or on the slide can be really, really helpful to avoid the transiency effect. Okay, so here, same passage, we've got a nice little picture this time, which is lovely, and we've got the relevant words here in the vocabulary box, and students can refer back to it. They can see which words are bolded and check the meanings of those as necessary, and that can be really helpful for getting the same information sort of done. Here, the CFU question I've got up straight away, but it doesn't matter. You can choose whether it comes up straight away or whether it comes later. But ideally, the text is also visible when students are doing the CFU question. If you have a whole page with the CFU question and the text disappears, that also becomes transient. So students have to try and remember the text while they're answering questions about the text. And the goal of the CFU question is not to see what they can remember. It's actually to see if they can answer some of a complex comprehension question. And so they need the text visible, ready to check back if they need it as well. In case you're wondering, most of these voyages' treasures came from other people's ships or towns along the European coasts and rivers, which the Vikings, which they're known for, had raided. So this is a follow-up question. Do you think the Vikings should be admired? And why or why not? So now this is my last little point to you tonight is, when do the redundancy and transiency effects, both from cognitive load theory, when do they start to rub up against each other? So how can we reduce information so that's not overwhelming, but not too much so it becomes transient? This is the challenge that I have for you. But thinking through your instruction and ensuring that it really does try and address some of these concerns could actually make a big difference for your learners and managing the cognitive load a lot better. So relating back to systematic synthetic phonics now, many of these principles can be seen in the way that we teach phonics in the early years in terms of reading and spelling. So remembering the key components from last webinar is building students' phonemic awareness, their code knowledge, their blending and segmenting, their scope and sequence, having irregular high frequency words, but also teaching routines. So we manage the extraneous load by having the same way of doing things frequently, giving lots of opportunities to respond, making sure the instruction is broken up. So it's not just pound, pound, pound with lots of information, actually lots of chances to practice using that information as well. And then also frequent checks for understanding, so that students are supported to do lots of great things and get lots of great feedback on their work as well. We are out of time. I might just do a little plug here to remind us about irregular words, for example, and how we can make this clearer and link this to cognitive load theory. Essentially, with cognitive load theory, we're trying to manage the new learning where possible. So if you can decode or spell some of that word, decode or spell some of that word. We're using your phonics knowledge. Point out the part that is new so that students can focus on that bit. Focus on the bit that breaks the pattern or that is a bit unusual, such as in the word was, the A is making an O sound, which is not that usual in this part of the phonics sequence when that word is introduced. And then use the letter name strategically when spelling the word. So you might say was is spelled W-A-S. How's it spelled? W-A-S. Rather than trying to say were, O, but spelled with an A, S, but sounding like a Z, etc. You sort of see how it's a bit clunky. Keeping it clear and keeping it neater might be really helpful. And finally, I'm going to go straight to questions and allow you to ask anything at this juncture. We've got about 2 minutes left. Ahmad's been waiting really patiently, asking if Mode B is like the finishing touches. I wouldn't say it's just the finishing touches. I would also say that it's the exciting applications and extensions upon what we might teach explicitly. For some units, it might be something rather contained or small, like write a brief story or a sentence using the words that we've been studying in this phonics sort of part of the unit. But sometimes it might be something quite extensive. So it might be a project or an inquiry task or a presentation that students prepare. So whether it's finishing touches or logical and necessary extensions and applications is really up to you figuring out what suits the unit. But any other questions that you can open up to the floor, and Bryn can help me spot any other ones that have come through.
Thanks. There's another question from Joanne. With the learning intention and success criteria, would you have the students write them down?
Depending on the age level, there is some benefit to getting the students to note these down, but just writing it down doesn't necessarily mean they understand what the learning intention is. It's more important that they can explain to their partner, for example, next to them, what are we learning about today and how do we know if we're successful, than it is for them to copy it into their books. You might want to have a record sometimes, but if it's for some of your students, getting them to copy something might actually take a really long time and may not be productive to what they're doing. Depending on the year level, you could make those decisions. It's really up to you. But you've got to make sure that it's meaningful and it's not just going through the motions of writing it in their books for the sake of it. Maybe there's a task or something that they're filling in so that it is a meaningful task, not just literally a rote task of copying from the board. Oh, there's a few more coming through.
Joanne said she's upper primary. I don't know if that.
Yeah. So I think upper primary, you could make a case for it in some cases, but maybe not every student, because maybe their spelling skills and writing skills aren't efficient enough to make that worthwhile. They might just be wasting 5 minutes of the class just trying to copy something down. So I'd be really intentional about that. Wondering how this would work in a special ed class. Sohail's asking. I would say that nearly all the things that we've talked about are applicable no matter who the learners are, whether they've got significant needs for extension or significant needs for support. These kinds of principles relate to how learning happens in general. The teacher just might use their time or their use of scaffolds slightly differently, depending on the background knowledge or the levels of proficiency or processing speed of their students. There are a few great case studies in Victoria and other parts of Australia where specialist settings are using these same principles and making logical adjustments and purposeful changes so that it's approachable and realistic, but essentially seeing the same principles working quite well no matter what they're teaching and who they're teaching.
Great. Joanne B, there's two Joannes we've discovered. She agrees. She says students should articulate their success, which makes a lot of sense.
Fantastic.
No more questions there at the moment. So we'll give you one more minute if you'd like to ask anything. Now's the time. Maybe we might talk about the upcoming webinars while we wait.
Good idea. Thank you for the prompt, Brim. Okay. So thank you for attending this webinar, which is the second of a series of 4. The other one, webinar 1, 3, and 4 are listed here. So webinar 1 is already on YouTube or on the Oxford University Press website. I encourage you to have a look at it if you're interested. Next webinar, we're looking at the benefits of spaced retrieval and practice. And then webinar 4 in August 27, we're looking at implementing impactful paired reading sessions in your classroom, which I'm really excited about paired reading fluency to talk to you about as well. And otherwise, any final questions?
No, nothing else has come through, so maybe we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I think I learned a lot, but I'll have to watch it again, I think, to take it all in. Yeah, awesome work. Thank you so much, everyone, for jumping on in your evening as well. I know it's after a long day at school, it's a lot to come and learn some more, but I really appreciate everyone joining. So everyone have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks.